This cannot be! My army! Defeated! How?
This isn't the story of a king who lacked soldiers or resources. It's the story of a king who had so much of both that he thought he could never lose. And when a ruler begins to believe he is unbeatable, history often finds a way to remind him otherwise. Meet King Darius I of Persia, a man who commanded the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. His borders stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the edges of Greece in the west. His wealth was unmatched. His armies were vast. His court lived in splendor beyond imagination. But even an empire of that size can be undone by arrogance, and that's exactly what happened in the year 490 BC. To understand the mistake that would soon follow, you need to picture the world of the time. Greece was not a unified country. It was a patchwork of city-states: Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, independent, each with its own government and army. For the most part, they quarreled with one another like siblings. But Persia was the giant in the background, looming over them all. The Persian Empire was not just larger than Greece, it was larger than anything the Greeks could comprehend. For a Greek farmer, it would have been like comparing a local village militia to an unstoppable storm. So why would Persia, with all its riches and power, bother with tiny Athens? The answer goes back a few years earlier to a region known as Ionia, on the coast of modern-day Turkey. Greek settlers had lived there for generations, but by the time of Darius, the region had fallen under Persian control. The Ionian Greeks grew restless, and eventually they revolted. It wasn't easy to stand against Persia, so they looked west to their cousins across the Aegean for help. Athens, a rising power at the time, sent ships, soldiers, and supplies. The revolt was bold but ultimately doomed. The Persians crushed it with overwhelming force, but Darius was not a man to forget an insult. Athens had dared to interfere in Persian affairs. Athens had dared to defy him, and now Athens would have to pay. When Darius decided on revenge, he didn't plan a minor raid, he planned a statement. His army, by some ancient accounts, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Even if those numbers are exaggerated, as they often are in ancient history, the force he gathered was still enormous compared to the armies of Greece. Imagine thousands of cavalrymen, tens of thousands of infantry, archers in vast ranks, and fleets of ships ferrying soldiers across the Aegean Sea. From Darius's perspective, Athens was nothing more than a small rebellious city-state that would crumble the moment Persian boots landed on Greek soil. And Darius believed something else, that fear itself would be his ally. He thought that when the Athenians saw the sheer size of his army, they would either surrender immediately or be crushed without much effort. It was the logic of a man who had never known real defeat. He ruled so much territory and commanded so many men that he could not imagine being outmaneuvered, let alone beaten. He thought his numbers alone made him invincible. But this confidence hid a dangerous flaw. Armies are not just about numbers, they are about terrain, morale, leadership, and tactics. And while Darius had overwhelming strength on paper, he didn't fully understand the land he was about to fight on. He didn't understand that the Athenians, though smaller in number, had something far more dangerous than fear. They had determination, unity, and the advantage of fighting for their survival on their own soil. The stage was now set for one of the most famous battles in history, the Battle of Marathon. But at this point in the story, what matters is the mindset of the Persian king. He believed the war was already won before it even began. He believed Athens was about to become an example to the rest of Greece of what happens when you dare to challenge the empire of Persia. It was the thinking of a ruler so confident that he could win with one hand tied behind his back. That kind of arrogance, history tells us, rarely goes unpunished. And soon, Darius would discover that even the mightiest empire in the world could be humbled by a group of farmers turned soldiers. This was only the beginning of a story that would shock both Persia and Greece. And it all started with the fatal flaw of a king who believed he was too powerful to ever lose. If you're enjoying this dive into the past, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian so you never miss the rest of the tale. What comes next will take us to the dusty plain of Marathon, where thousands of Persian warriors marched confidently, only to meet an enemy they never expected. When news spread that the Persians were on their way, panic rippled through Athens. The sheer size of the enemy force seemed impossible to resist. Imagine being a farmer, a craftsman, or a trader, suddenly called to fight not just for your city, but for your very existence. These were not full-time soldiers. Most were ordinary men who had families, homes, and fields to tend. Yet when the call came, they put on their bronze helmets, strapped on their shields, and marched to war. Their only thought was that if they did not fight, there would be no Athens left to return to. The Persians landed at a place called Marathon, a wide, flat plain northeast of the city. It was an ideal spot for them. They had cavalry, they had archers, and they had the kind of numbers that could spread out across the field and crush anything in front of them. But while it may have looked like the perfect ground for Persia's mighty army, it also became the site where Athens would make one of its boldest and most dangerous decisions. The Athenians didn't wait for the Persians to march directly on the city. Instead, they marched out themselves, choosing to meet their enemy at Marathon. To modern ears, this may not sound unusual, but it was a massive gamble. Athens had perhaps 10,000 men, give or take. The Persians, depending on which ancient account you believe, had anywhere between 20,000 and 100,000. Even if we take the lower estimates, the Athenians were still facing at least double their number. But the Greeks understood something the Persians did not. Numbers alone do not win battles. Terrain matters, discipline matters. The Persians had more men, but their strength lay in cavalry and ranged fighting horsemen to charge down the flanks, and archers to rain arrows from a distance. The Greeks, on the other hand, specialized in something very different: the phalanx. The phalanx was the backbone of Greek warfare. Picture rows upon rows of men standing shoulder to shoulder, each one carrying a large round shield and a spear that jutted out in front of them. Their shields overlapped, forming a wall of bronze, and their spears turned the formation into a kind of moving fortress. In close quarters, this formation was nearly impossible to break. It relied on unity, discipline, and the strength of ordinary men pushing together as one. The Athenians knew that if they allowed the Persians to spread out, if they allowed the cavalry to run free, their phalanx would be overwhelmed. But if they could force the Persians into a tight space, the phalanx would become a deadly weapon. That is why Marathon mattered. The plain was open enough for battle, but narrow enough that the Persians could not fully unleash their superior numbers. And more importantly, the terrain behind the Athenian position was rougher and less suited for cavalry charges. By choosing Marathon, the Athenians had effectively tilted the battlefield in their favor. It did not make them safe, but it gave them a fighting chance. Still, the decision was terrifying. Every Athenian knew that if they lost, there would be no second line of defense. The Persians would march on Athens, burn it, enslave its people, and wipe the city from history. This was not just a battle. It was survival. The pressure was immense, and yet the Athenians stood firm. They were joined by a small force of allies from the city of Plataea, perhaps 1,000 men, who chose to stand with Athens in its darkest hour. Their presence was small compared to the Persian host, but it mattered. It showed that not all of Greece was content to sit back and watch. Meanwhile, the Persians were confident. Why wouldn't they be? From their perspective, they had crushed revolts, conquered empires, and subdued regions far larger than Athens. This was supposed to be easy. To them, the Athenians were just another defiant city-state that needed to be taught a lesson. They set up their camp, they unloaded their ships, and they prepared to show the Greeks what happened when you defied the King of Kings. For days, the two sides faced each other across the plain, neither willing to make the first move. The Athenians hesitated to attack because they feared the Persian cavalry. The Persians hesitated because they wanted the Athenians to break first. Every night, men on both sides tried to sleep, knowing that when dawn came, it might bring death. Imagine the silence before battle, campfires burning, soldiers whispering, the distant sound of waves against the shore. Everyone knew that a clash was inevitable. The only question was, who would strike first? It was here, on the field of Marathon, that the Athenians made a daring choice. Instead of waiting for the Persians to come to them, they would take the initiative. They would charge. It was an insane decision on paper. No one charges headlong across a plain into an enemy with superior numbers and cavalry support. And yet, that was exactly what they planned to do. The Athenians believed that shock, speed, and discipline could offset the Persian advantage. If they could hit the Persian lines before the cavalry returned from a scouting mission, they could disrupt the entire Persian battle plan. The battlefield had been chosen with care. Now it was time to gamble everything on one strike. The Athenians would either defend their city in glory or die to the last man on the plain of Marathon. When the Athenians finally charged, the Persians thought it was a joke. Who in their right mind would sprint across open ground toward a much larger army? To the Persians, it looked like the Greeks had lost their nerve and were fleeing. The dust rising from the plain only added to the illusion. But what the Persians did not realize was that this flight was actually a carefully calculated move. The Athenians had closed ranks, shields locked, spears ready, and were running with purpose. The phalanx, when standing still, was terrifying enough. But imagine thousands of armored men charging in unison, bronze glinting in the sun, shields crashing against one another as they ran. To the Persians, who were used to lightly armed opponents, this was unlike anything they had ever faced. Still, confident in their numbers, the Persians rushed forward to meet them. And that was their first fatal mistake. In their eagerness to crush what they believed was a broken Greek line, the Persians overcommitted to the center. They poured their strength into the middle of the battlefield, expecting the Greek formation to collapse on impact. But the Athenians had deliberately arranged their lines to exploit this very reaction. Their center was thinner than the rest of their formation, almost inviting the Persians to push through. On the wings, however, the Athenians had stacked their best men, thick ranks of hoplites ready to envelop anyone foolish enough to advance too far. The clash was brutal. Arrows darkened the sky, bouncing off Greek shields. Persian infantry, armed with lighter armor and shorter spears, slammed into the Athenian center. For a moment, it seemed as if the Persians might break through, but the Athenian soldiers held, pushing back with their shields, stabbing forward with their long spears, each man trusting the one beside him. The air filled with the sounds of bronze striking flesh, shields smashing into bodies, and men shouting to keep the line. Then came the turning point. As the Persians pressed hard against the Greek center, the Athenian wings began to move. The hoplites on the flanks curved inward like a pair of jaws closing shut. Suddenly, the Persians, who had been so confident of victory, found themselves trapped. They were surrounded on three sides, packed so tightly they could barely raise their weapons. The weight of their own numbers worked against them. Soldiers at the back tried to push forward, while those in front were being cut down, unable to retreat. What had begun as an easy victory for Persia was unraveling into chaos. The Greeks, though fewer, were disciplined and relentless. Every man in the phalanx understood his role. Every push, every thrust of the spear was coordinated. The Persians, by contrast, lacked the armor and cohesion to withstand this kind of close-quarters assault. Their archers were useless once the lines closed, and their cavalry, the very force that could have broken the Greeks, was nowhere to be seen, either delayed or caught off guard. As the Persian center crumbled, panic spread. Soldiers tried to flee back toward the safety of their ships, but the narrow plain and the ferocity of the Greek pursuit turned their retreat into a slaughter. Men threw down their weapons, trampled one another, or drowned in the marshes near the shore as they tried to escape. The very advantage of numbers that Persia had boasted became a liability as the sheer crush of men turned their withdrawal into disaster. The Athenians did not let up. They pressed the attack, driving the Persians toward the sea. Ancient accounts say that the Persians lost thousands in the rout, while the Athenians suffered only a fraction of that. Whether those numbers are exact or exaggerated, the point is clear. The smaller, disciplined force had humiliated the largest empire in the world. What makes this battle even more striking is how it was remembered by those who fought in it. For the Athenians, this was not just a military victory. It was proof that courage, discipline, and strategy could overcome overwhelming odds. Imagine being one of those farmers, merchants, or artisans, standing in the phalanx. One moment, you are staring down the greatest army the world has ever seen, certain that death is coming. The next, you are watching that same army break and run in terror from your spear and shield. It must have felt like a miracle, a moment that would be told and retold for generations. For the Persians, the defeat was more than just a battlefield loss. It was an insult, a humiliation delivered by what they considered a small and insignificant people. The King of Kings had been defied by farmers in bronze armor, and his mighty warriors had been sent fleeing back to their ships. This was not how it was supposed to end. The Persians had made a critical tactical error, believing their numbers and reputation alone would win the day. But warfare is not just about numbers. It is about terrain, timing, and, above all, discipline. The Athenians understood that. The Persians, in their arrogance, did not. And so, what should have been an easy victory became one of the most famous defeats in ancient history. The plain of Marathon was now soaked in blood, littered with broken weapons, and the bodies of those who had underestimated the resolve of a free people fighting for survival. The Athenians had done the impossible, but this was only the beginning. The plain of Marathon was supposed to be the place where Athens fell. The Persians had come expecting a swift, overwhelming victory, the kind of campaign that would remind the rest of Greece why it was foolish to resist the great king. Instead, it became a graveyard for their pride. The Athenians, with their discipline and sheer determination, didn't just hold their ground, they broke the Persian army. The numbers speak for themselves. Ancient sources like Herodotus tell us the Persians lost more than 6,400 men, while the Athenians counted only 192 dead. Even if we take those figures with a grain of salt, the imbalance is staggering. How could such a smaller force inflict such heavy losses on the most powerful empire of the time? The answer lies in the way the Athenians fought. Their hoplite formation, the phalanx, was not designed for flashy maneuvers. It was simple, brutal, and effective. A wall of bronze, shields overlapping, spears jutting forward, advancing step by step until the enemy either broke or died. Against lighter Persian armor, shorter weapons, and soldiers unused to that kind of pressure, the result was devastating. For the Persians, chaos followed. What had begun as confidence turned into panic, and panic in an army that size is contagious. Men at the back had no idea what was happening at the front. They pushed forward, jamming their comrades, while those in front were being cut down or crushed. Some Persians fled toward the marshes and drowned in the mud, while others sprinted to the sea, trying desperately to reach the safety of their ships. But the Athenians pursued them without mercy, cutting down stragglers and driving the survivors into the water. The great army of the King of Kings was now little more than a broken, bloodied mob scrambling to escape. And yet, the story doesn't end there. The Persians were not done. Even in defeat, they still had ships, and ships meant mobility. They could abandon Marathon and sail directly to Athens, which at that moment was almost undefended. The bulk of the Athenian army was still on the battlefield, exhausted and bloodied. If the Persians reached the city before the army could return, the victory at Marathon would mean nothing. The Persians could burn Athens, enslave its people, and claim they had won. The Athenians knew this. They had no time to celebrate, no time to even bury their dead. The moment the battle ended, they began a forced march back to Athens, 26 miles, across rugged terrain under the blazing sun. Still in armor, still carrying weapons, it was a desperate race against time. This march was not about glory, it was about survival. If they lost this final sprint, their city would fall. And this is where legend meets history. According to the story, one soldier named Pheidippides was chosen to run ahead of the army and deliver the news. He ran from Marathon to Athens without stopping, burst into the assembly, shouted, "We have won," and then collapsed, dead from exhaustion. That run, roughly 26 miles, inspired the modern marathon race. Whether or not every detail of that story is true, the symbolism is undeniable. It captures the essence of the moment. A people so desperate to defend their freedom that they pushed themselves beyond the limits of human endurance. Imagine what it must have been like for the citizens waiting in Athens. Rumors must have swirled, fear hanging heavy in the air. Would the Persians come storming into the city at any moment? Would they be slaughtered, enslaved, their homes burned? And then, suddenly, the sight of their soldiers, dusty, sweat-soaked, battered, but alive, marching back into the city not as survivors, but as victors. The relief must have been overwhelming. The Persians, seeing the city now guarded and their chance for surprise gone, chose not to risk another fight. They turned their ships and sailed away. The shock of it all cannot be overstated. The greatest empire in the known world had been defeated by a single city-state, a tiny fraction of its size and power. The Persians had expected an easy lesson in obedience. Instead, they had been humiliated. For the Athenians, this was more than just a victory. It was a statement. They had shown that freedom, discipline, and strategy could stand against empire and tyranny. The psychological impact was enormous. From this point forward, the Greeks knew they were capable of resisting Persia. The battlefield itself became sacred ground. The Athenians built a burial mound at Marathon for their 192 dead, honoring them not just as fallen soldiers, but as heroes who had saved their city. They planted trophies, held ceremonies, and told stories of the men who stood shoulder to shoulder and defied the impossible. Every year, the names of the fallen were remembered, their sacrifice carved into the collective memory of Athens. And yet, there was also a sobering reality. The Persians had been beaten, yes, but they were not gone. They would return, stronger and angrier than before. King Darius's pride had been wounded, and his successor, Xerxes, would make sure to exact revenge. For the Athenians, Marathon was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much larger struggle that would shape the history of Greece for generations. But for that single day, on that narrow plain, the impossible had happened. A small band of citizen soldiers had stood against the might of Persia and won. Their victory would echo down the centuries, retold not only as a moment of Greek pride, but as a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to bow to overwhelming odds. And it all began with a charge that seemed like madness and ended with a run that became legend. Marathon was not just a battle, it was a message carved into history. Arrogance can fall, empires can stumble, and even the greatest kings are not invincible. The victory at the Battle of Marathon was not just a battle won on a narrow plain outside Athens. It was a turning point that changed the course of Western history. For centuries, the Persian Empire had been seen as unstoppable. They ruled over lands stretching from the Indus River in the east to the edges of Egypt in the west. They had armies that seemed endless, cavalry that could sweep across plains, and fleets that could dominate seas. To face them, for any small city-state, felt like suicide. Yet in 490 BC, the Athenians, backed only by a small group from the city of Plataea, had done the unthinkable. They had beaten the giant. This victory shattered the myth of Persian invincibility. Imagine being a farmer in Athens, someone who just weeks earlier had been preparing for harvest, now standing on a battlefield looking at thousands of fallen Persian soldiers. It must have felt unreal. These were men from the largest empire the world had ever known, armed, supplied, and sent with the full might of King Darius. Yet they lay defeated by people who, in reality, had everything to lose and no guarantee of victory. It wasn't only a military win, it was proof that courage, discipline, and smart tactics could outweigh numbers and intimidation. The Athenians understood that they had survived a brush with annihilation. Had they lost, their city would have been burned, their families enslaved, their way of life destroyed. Instead, they returned home as heroes. Their dead were honored with a burial mound on the field of Marathon itself, a permanent reminder of the price of freedom. That mound still stands today, silent but powerful, as though guarding the memory of those who gave their lives. But what made this victory a defining moment wasn't just the survival of Athens, it was the ripple effect it caused. The Greeks began to believe in themselves in a way they hadn't before. For generations, city-states like Athens, Sparta, and Thebes had been rivals, fighting each other almost as much as they defended themselves against outsiders. The victory at Marathon planted the seed of a new idea that united, or at least determined, the Greeks could stand against even the greatest empire in the world. Think about the psychological impact. Before Marathon, the Persians seemed untouchable. After Marathon, they were beatable. That's the kind of shift in confidence that changes not just politics, but culture. Within decades, Athens would transform into a hub of democracy, philosophy, art, and science. Figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle would emerge from a society that believed it could shape its own destiny. The plays of Sophocles and Euripides, the sculptures of Phidias, and the architecture of the Parthenon, all of these flourished in a Greece that had been saved at Marathon. And the story didn't end there. Marathon was only the beginning of a larger struggle. Darius would die before he could avenge the loss, but his son Xerxes would return a decade later with an even greater army, determined to crush the Greeks once and for all. That invasion would give us some of history's most famous moments: the stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, the naval clash at Salamis, and finally the Greek triumph at Plataea. But none of that would have been possible if Athens had fallen at Marathon. Marathon gave the Greeks time to prepare, time to believe, time to realize that they were capable of something extraordinary. Without that, Greece might have been absorbed into the Persian Empire like so many other lands before it. The world would have been very different. No Socrates, no Plato, no Aristotle, no Parthenon rising above Athens. no plays that still influence theater today. Western civilization as we know it might never have taken shape. The battle itself also left us with a legacy that continues even in small, unexpected ways. The legend of Pheidippides, the messenger who ran from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory, still echoes today every time someone runs a marathon. Whether or not the story happened exactly as told, it captures the sense of urgency and desperation of the moment. A single man racing against time, carrying news that his people had survived against impossible odds. That image has lasted for over 2,000 years. When you put it all together, the Battle of Marathon wasn't just about tactics, or numbers, or even bravery on the battlefield. It was about what happens when people refuse to surrender, even when every logical reason says they should. It was about a society deciding that its freedom, its way of life, was worth risking everything for, and against all odds, that gamble paid off. As we close this story, think about the sheer scale of what happened on that plain. A tiny city-state, with farmers and craftsmen making up its army, stood against the world's greatest empire. And it was an upset so dramatic that it still inspires us thousands of years later. And it shows that history is often written not by the biggest armies, but by the boldest choices. If you've enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of hubris, strategy, and shocking turns in history, make sure you like this video. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. There are countless strange, surprising, and even hilarious stories from the past that show us just how unpredictable human history really is. And I'll be here to tell them all.